status on the Ninth Providence?
Still adrift, Commander. But sensors just picked up something moving toward the hull.
Debris?
I don't think so.
By the time the Convergence Warfleet finished drafting an official report on what he'd done, the human in question had already forgotten which ship he'd saved. He wasn't being modest. He genuinely could not recall. I'm Gabe Whitfield, and I want to be upfront that Tuesdays are usually the worst part of my week, and this one was shaping up to be no different, because scrap hauling in a 50-year-old tow ship mostly means chasing junk that isn't worth the fuel it costs to catch it. So when my scanner pinged on something the size of a small moon, I figured it was another dead mining barge somebody forgot to pay storage fees on. I grabbed my thermos, cranked up the radio, and went to take a look, because free scrap is still scrap, and scrap pays rent. Corin noticed the anomaly first, a single unregistered vessel drifting toward the crippled dreadnought at a speed that made no tactical sense, far too slow for an attack run, and far too confident for a scavenger. He flagged it as debris at first, because nothing sane approached a wounded Regnant-class warship without an escort, a transponder, or the slightest hint of fear. He almost stopped watching. Then the contact extended something long and metallic toward the hull, and Corin's hands went still over the console, and the officers nearby quietly stopped pretending they weren't watching too. What kind of creature approached a dying warship carrying nothing but a rope? I hooked the tow cable to the biggest structural point I could find, which turned out to be a reinforced spar near what I'd later learn was the Sovereign's personal shuttle bay, and gave it a good tug to make sure it'd hold. The whole hulk was venting atmosphere out of a gash near the stern, which is honestly the most common thing in the world if you've worked debris fields long enough. So I patched it the way I patch everything. Canned sealant foam, held in place with my boot until it cured. Somewhere behind that hull, alarms I couldn't hear were apparently going off like it was the end of the world. Yenna's readings made no sense. The hull breach that had been bleeding their reserve atmosphere for hours had simply stopped, sealed by a substance her sensors couldn't classify beyond carbon-based, expanding, oddly effective. She flagged it as a curiosity, logged it, and moved on to the tow cable, expecting an easier answer. She did not get one. The tensile load required to move a 900,000-ton derelict was well beyond anything a single unarmored organism should generate, and yet the cable was taut, and the ship was moving, and her hands had started shaking somewhere around the second recalculation. She pulled up an external camera and found the source crouched on the hull, without a tether, without visible strain, adjusting the line like he was tying a shoe. What was strong enough to do that with its bare hands, and why did it look so bored doing it? The tow line held better than I expected, which was good, because that accretion disk behind the wreck was pulling everything in slow, and slow is the kind of thing that sneaks up on you if you don't pay attention. I've hauled bigger, heavier, and angrier things out of worse gravity wells for less pay, so I just leaned into the winch, hummed along to whatever was playing on my radio, and let the old girl do her work. Something on the wreck's hull kept flashing lights at me in a pattern I didn't recognize, so I waved back because that seemed polite and got back to humming. Vex had commanded 3 campaigns and lost 2 crews, and nothing in either had prepared him for the report now glowing on his screen. An unarmored biped had single-handedly arrested their fall into the accretion disk using equipment that belonged, by every scan they'd run, in a hardware supply catalog rather than a warship's arsenal. He ordered a hail, expecting silence, a demand for tribute, or a coded threat in some dialect the translators would need an hour to untangle. Instead, the creature's voice came back light and completely unbothered. "Yeah, hi, you're stable. You can thank me later. I'm kind of off the clock." Vex stared at the console without blinking. "You are aware," he said carefully, "of what you just moved." The reply came back almost cheerful. "Big whatever it is. Seen bigger." Vex closed the channel and sat in silence. If this was what an off-duty human sounded like, what in the void did they sound like on the clock? Corin ran the human's registry code through every database the Convergence had, half expecting the system to flag a Black Ops designation, a veteran unit, something that explained the math. It came back with a salvage license, 6 unpaid parking citations from a station he'd never heard of, and a note that the vessel's insurance had lapsed 11 months ago. There was no military record. There was no record of training at all. Corin read it twice, then again, searching for the part that made sense. What did it mean for a species if this was what they let walk around unsupervised? Once the tow was steady, I figured I might as well get their power back online while I was already out there, since a dark, dead ship tends to drift into worse things than gravity wells if you leave it long enough. I popped the auxiliary conduit panel, jumped the relay the way you jump a car battery, and gave it a solid whack with the flat of my wrench for good measure, because that's just how old systems wake up sometimes. Lights came back on across the entire hull in one long ripple, deck by deck, like a string of Christmas lights catching one after another. I radioed over that they were good to go, finished my coffee, and started coiling my cable. Yenna watched every backup system on a warship she had spent a decade studying reboot in the correct sequence, on the first try, from a single impact of unknown metal alloy against a panel that her own engineers hadn't been able to diagnose. She did not have a category for that in any of her logs. She opened a new one. What manual, she wondered, taught a species to fix warships by hitting them? The sovereign, Illyra Ven, came down to the bridge herself to ask who had saved her ship, her voice low with an emotion Vex hadn't heard from her since the war began, and for a long moment nobody answered, because nobody trusted the answer they were holding. Finally, Corin pulled up the readout. One human, no rank, no weapon, registered occupation, independent salvage contractor. Total vessel value assessed at less than the cost of the coffee thermos bolted to its own dashboard. The sovereign asked very quietly what kind of species produced a soldier like that without even meaning to. Vex had no answer that didn't end with every strategist in the Convergence quietly moving humanity's threat file to a color that didn't officially exist yet. I got a very formal invitation to come aboard afterward. All lights and honor guards and a woman in a very shiny outfit who kept calling me savior, which felt like a lot for somebody who mostly just wanted to know if the tow job qualified for hazard pay. She asked what I wanted as a reward, and I told her a fuel voucher would be nice, since I was already running late clocking back in. She looked at me like I'd said something profound, glanced at Vex, and said nothing at all for a long moment. Somebody behind her actually started writing that down. Honestly, I still don't know what the big deal was. The leak wasn't even that bad. Before I left, the sovereign asked, through a translator that seemed to be struggling with the tone as much as the words, whether all humans could do what I had done. I told her honestly that I was just a guy with a tow ship and a decent wrench, and that anybody in my line of work would have done the same for the finder's fee alone. Nobody on that bridge looked comforted by that answer. If anything, they looked worse. Somewhere in the Convergence archives there's now a file listing humanity's threat classification as unknown. Do not anger, do not think, do not attempt to repay in gratitude alone, right next to a handwritten note that just says, send cash instead.